but they're very cool. I love these. So next step, I'm going to show you, well, I'm going to show you a couple things. One thing is for your reinforcement around the top, and you can also use this for lacing material. This is some poplar bark. When you cut down the small tree, there's going to be some limbs that come off of it, and there's going to be a small part of the tree on the outside. You know, in the interest of not wasting anything, peel that bark off into strips. Again, to get the right width, you can just take your scissors and cut it into strips, just like cutting paper. It's not difficult at all. While it's still fresh, you want to take this outer bark off. Now I've done some with the outer bark, but it tends to crack and make the bark stiff. The inner bark is very tough, just like with hickory or ash or anybody who's ever worked with bark. You know what that is, you know what it's like when you're using the bark strips to make chairs and things like that. Poplar's not as tough as those barks, but it's still very good. And you're just going to take a pocket knife and just shave off that outer layer of bark. Shave the dark stuff and the green stuff to leave you with the yellowish or whitish bark. Okay, and that's all we're going to do. Comes off very easily as long as you don't dig down too deeply. And again, this is just like the baskets. Once you get this outer bark peeled off, you've got your strips of the inner bark. You can save this for 20 years if you keep the bugs out of it stuff. If you want to use it, throw it in some water, rehydrate it, and it's just as good as the day that you remove the bark. So we're just going to remove that off to get strips. Here are some in the interest of time and not just watch me carve for an hour on the video. Here are some that I've already done. But you just take that off and you've got the inner bark. And you can leave it like this. Sometimes I go ahead and roll it up just to give it some memory to being bent, so that when I put it around the basket it bends a little bit easier when it dries out later, so it doesn't tend to want to crack as badly. And so you can just kind of roll this up, tie it, let it dry, come back a couple years later if need be, and you've got it ready to go. But this is going to go when you make the basket. The purpose of this is you need reinforcement around the top to help it hold its shape, and this is going to be wrapped around the top. I like to do one on the outside, one on the inside. So this is going to be wrapped kind of like this and then laced onto the basket on the top. That's why we're doing this. You can also take the strips to use to lace the sides of the basket up. One traditional way to do that is to make the baskets of poplar bark but make the lacing of hickory bark, because it's a much tougher, stronger bark. That works well, the inner bark of hickory. I usually use deer rawhide or buckskin or hemp twine or something like that. But just any kind of material that can be used to lace with, roots or bark or anything, can be used to lace these together. And then around the top, I like to use the bark of the poplar because I usually have that bark when I take the poplar down. But you could also use vines or saplings or anything like that. Just anything that you can think of that could be wrapped around it works as a reinforcement. So I will show you soon the next steps, which will be putting the holes in it, lacing up the sides, putting the reinforcement, lacing the top, and then putting your handle on top of it. Okay, hope you're enjoying this. To put the holes up the side of the basket, you can do this with a drill. If you have like a cordless drill, you can just zip it in and out. That's the quickest way. You could use a stone drill, you could use a handheld, just a screwdriver or anything. The main thing is to be careful that you don't make a split, and because of that you don't want to be too close to the edge. I like to move in, about a quarter of an inch, I'd say. It depends on the size of the basket. A larger basket you can move over further without it looking silly, but you don't want to put the lacing holes right on the edge because that will split out and your basket will fall apart. So you're going to lace these holes right up the side very carefully, and then you're just going to be lacing up. How you space them is up to you. I don't like to go more than about 1.5 inches apart, even on my big baskets, because then they're not strong enough. So the tighter you lace them together, the stronger they're going to be, the closer you put your hose. However, the more of a pain in the neck it's going to be to lace your basket up. If you put your hose twice as close together, you're looking at least twice the amount of time to lace it up because it gets real tedious. So I try to find a happy medium between a strong basket and not having too much tedium in trying to lace it up. So I'm just going to do this by hand with a wood drill bit with the tip of it. I like drilling in rather than pushing in because you're just less likely to split the bark. I'm spacing these approximately 1 inch, and I'm not measuring them. If you want to be fancy about it, you can measure it, make it very precise, but again, as with the scoring, I like it as primitive as I can get it, and as long as it's functional, I really don't care if it's precise. But I'm just lacing these up, and then so on this side of the bark I'll do the same thing, directly opposing the hose on that side for my lacing. And there are a huge number of techniques for lacing these. Just any way that you can lace things together works on these. An X stitch or cross stitch, like kind of like tying your shoes up, lacing your shoes up, is about my favorite because the X reinforces the side of it. But you can do like a zigzag stitch. You can go straight across. There's just a number of different ways you can do it, and that's totally up to you. All of them work fine once your basket gets dried out, if you can hold it shaped till it dries out. So I'm not going to show you every single one of these holes because it's kind of boring, but basically I'm just going to do what I'm doing here. This is the amount of space I like to have. Everybody's different, every basket's different, and I will lace these all the way on up to the top. I'll flip it over, I'll do the same up this side. Then depending on my reinforcement, how thick it is, I will do the same thing around the top. So let's say I'm going to use a reinforcement about this thick. I'll come just slightly below it, and I will drill through. And then about an inch or so, depending on how you want to space it, how much time you want to spend lacing, and the same height down. I'll do another one. And I'm going to do this all the way around the perimeter or the circumference of the top of the basket. I'm just going to do that all the way around, and then when I put my reinforcement on, it'll be ready to lace. Another way to do this, another variation, is to put your reinforcements on, especially if it's a flat piece of bark such as this, and you can just drill right through your reinforcement. A lot of times people do that, so I could just drill it right through the reinforcement. I don't usually like to do that. I like to drill just underneath it, and as you can see, this is just the perfect height for that reinforcement. There's a reinforcement band. The lacing's going to come over it. It's going to go through the basket, the bark right underneath it. That's the perfect size for this size basket and this size reinforcement. Okay, so that's all you're doing with the hose. You drill them up both sides, drill them around the top. I'm not going to show you that. I'll come back having that done, and then I'll show you some lacing, and then we'll move on from there. Okay, now we're ready to begin lacing up our basket, and there's a number of different stitches and ways you can do that. The most common one I use is probably it's like a cross stitch, just like lacing up a pair of shoes. You take whatever you're lacing with and poke it through the two bottom holes, and then you just crisscross it as you work your way up, and it makes this pattern. A stronger variation of that, if you're really wanting to make a strong basket, is to do that all the way up, then come back through on the opposite holes all the way back down. So you can see the difference. Here you have a cross and a space and a cross and a space. Here there's no space. It's cross, 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 cross all the way up. This makes a much sturdier basket, but it's way, way more time consuming. So it just depends on what you're trying to make. And you can do the cross stitching across the top the same way, making the X's on it. Usually on the top I don't do the cross stitching. I don't find that's necessary. I just whip stitch over whatever it is that I'm trying to use as my reinforcement. In this case it's a piece of willow bark, but you can just whip stitch it over the top. A more common thing that I use if I'm using a really strong lacing material such as rawhide is I will just poke it through from the inside on the bottom and tie a knot on the inside that won't pull through the hole, and then I just whip stitch it around like this through the holes and make a single layer and then tie it off up at the top. And the reason I start at the bottom on these is it's much easier if you start at the bottom and work your way to the top, because if you work at the top and close that off, then you can't get your hand down in the basket to lace it as you get toward the bottom. So I always start at the bottom, and I usually always start both sides at the same time. Because again, if you get this side all the way laced up and this one's not, you can't get your hand down in there. So always start at the bottom and get both sides started at the same time. It's much easier to lace up. Okay, so this one I've started with deer buckskin, lacing it up, and I'll start here at the bottom. And I'm also going to start the other side here in just a second so I can have them both going at once. And one important thing is you want both pieces of the bark to match up evenly on the side, because that will help the wood support itself, help the bark support itself. If one piece folds under the other piece, the basket is weaker and it tends to want to collapse in on itself. So you want these things matched up evenly. Otherwise the bark will tend to curl under. So I want to make sure both pieces of bark are touching with a nice even line. Now, sometimes you lace it up, you get to the top, and you realize, oops, at some point the bark slipped under like this. That's not a problem. You can take something like this little flat screwdriver, and you can just pry the bark out so that it does match up evenly. And then again, you can get it even. If it sticks out too much to one side or the other, you can do that, and now you have a nice even crease again. That's very important to help the basket stay nice and structurally sound and not collapse, and it will want to try to wrinkle in on this edge, so that's something that you want to do. Okay.